Porter's five forces. This is a highly common principle which is prevalent in the industry when it comes to usage. The primary aspect of the forces is just to identify the macro factors that has an impact on the company. It's a simple tool, yes, a pretty strong one though. Help identify the competition, where it comes from, definitely, and plan ahead. You know, just take a look at the airline industry. We will be talking about this topic later. It helps to identify where the rivals stand and how deep or how strong they are, and on the other side how active the buyers are. So this kind of analysis makes the Porter an essential principle in analyzing a company strategy. So these are the five forces: rivalry, competition, supplier power. Every company depends on a uplink, the supply chain, downstream as well towards the distributor, so they have power, immense. Buyer power, customers, consumers, the possibility of a substitution coming in, that is something. For example, let's take the soap industry now. The soap has become a bit too expensive for quite a number of percentage in Sri Lanka, and we have this bar soap coming in. That's a substitution that could threaten the established order in the soap industry, such as one held by Sunlight. The bar soap seems to be more popular because it's cheaper. Threat to new entry, that's always a challenge in multiple industries. In brief, so take a look at the meaning of them: new entry, substitution, buyer power, supplier power, competitive rivalry. Take some reading on it. And while we do that, let's take a look at the soft drink industry. What about the competitive rivalry? There's not too much of competition in the soft drink industry because it's rather heavy cost in running the operation, especially maintaining a huge production capacity as well as a massive supplier network. Supplier power, somewhat, right? Not too much of a power because soft drink contains pretty basic ingredients. You don't need too many suppliers on that. Buyer power is massive in the soft drink industry, so that's why the cost of soft drink is maintained across the board. Substitution instead of soft drinks, maybe tea, maybe Nescafe, somewhat. New entry, well, it's a possibility, right? Threat of new entry is not too distant. We've had some new entrants coming into the industry, so likewise it helps studying the entire industry. That's the value of the porters. Okay, let's go one by one. Take a look at the banking. Thinking banking, read the content please. We do have plenty of banks. Virtually every town has a banking street, literally. One bank close to the other, right, in the same street mostly, generally. They provide similar products, not much of a difference. So the only difference could be perhaps the ambience, the welcome, the employee attitude, speed of delivery, few things, not many. But the rivalry is pretty strict, very tough in the banking industry. It is there. What about the supplier power? Again, read the content. While looking at the content, take a look at the motor car industry. If you look at the picture here, you can see the number of parts, components that a car may need. The reality is most of these parts do come from different suppliers. So inside a motor car may, stay hundreds of products made by hundreds of different companies, suppliers. Do they have the power over the industry? That's rather doubtful, because a motor car manufacturer has more power than the suppliers. These suppliers tend to be rather small players, but perhaps some specific suppliers, like for example, take batteries. Very few companies do make batteries, so there may be a bit of power held by the suppliers, but generally the supplier power in the motor car industry is somewhat less. Also, cost of switching. That means, can you switch from one supplier to the other? Very high across the industry, right? Generally, suppliers are weaker. Manufacturers can call shots in most of the industries. Buyer power, consumer. Again, take a look at the motor car industry. Can the consumers change the demand in the industry? Definitely so. Rising oil prices, the high cost of the motor car, components like the tires, may result in the rise or the flow or the fall of flow as well, right, of the motor car industry sales. So the buyers do have sufficient power over motor car manufacturers. So due to this reason only, the motor car manufacturers keep on innovating themselves continuously, from the door lock to the seat positioning to everything around the place. Motor car industry is one of the fastest changing industries over the last 40 years or so, because of the power of the buyer in determining what kind of a traveling vehicle that they need. Switch to substitutes. Well, you could always use the public transport, the train. Motorbike is a substitute, could be utilized. And the customers, the average number of motor cars sold in the world is over 2 billion per year. So it's a massive industry. It's technically demand driven. It has huge pull into the industry. So the buyers have the power to make their decisions mostly in the industry. New entrants coming in, especially the industries where the entry cost, the initial costs are less. The possibility of new entrants coming is somewhat high, like stationery industry, where the initial cost may be less. So an established player like Atlas or whoever, right, would need to look back to see any new kid coming in on the block. That is a possibility. Of course, where the entry costs are high, the new entrants are lesser, such as airline industry, maybe even soft drink industry to a certain extent. Banking industry, definite entry costs are high, but there are so much of industries where the entry costs are not exactly that much. Therein lies an opportunity for a new entrant to come in. And there again, especially if the industry is something where the buyers can easily switch from one product to the other, the chance for the new entrants are high. Some industries do have automatic barriers, like the cost. In some cases, the regulations are there, government rules are there. If I give an example, let's say the airline industry, there are certain restrictions that may prevent a new airline from coming in to play in Sri Lanka, except for Sri Lankan Airlines. And banking, finance, there are restrictions. But then so many other industries do not hold much of restrictions, such as the boutique hotels, right? Arrival of Airbnb, the boutique hotels and the hostels and the homestays, new entrants, right, have had a big impact negatively on the larger hotels during the last 3-4 years in Sri Lanka. Next is so let's take one couple of industries. Take a look at the airline industry. What are the characteristics? intense forces. There's massive competition in the airline industry. Nearly 1 billion people travel annually with the help of air services. Mm, every air route, every air corridor, every airport is intensely fought for by the airline industry. But the initial investment is very, very high. It's not small cost industry. And yes, there's licensing, insurance, regulations, controls, checks and balances, lots of checks. So much of things are happening in order to ensure the safety. And then the COVID guidelines, so there are lots of regulations in the industry. But still, the new entrant into the airline industry can run the operation at a lower cost because his number of planes may be less, the number of staff could be less, so he could run a budget airline very easily with lesser cost. Although the initial entry cost is low, anyone coming in as a new entrant into the industry can compete with healthy prices against the more established players who will have to spend a lot. And then experience play a role. This is an industry where the expertise is highly required in multiple sectors. You cannot be one who depending on the novices here. You need the trained people. And yes, supplier power, plane manufacturers, the plane parts, even the airports, they also play a supplier role, as well as the aircraft oil. Suppliers have high power here over the airline industry. Buyers have high power. Customers can easily switch from airline to airline. Very little brand loyalty. Being Sri Lankan, we may love to fly Sri Lankan, but we have other choices, sometimes less cost. And yes, substitution is there, especially in places like Europe and China, even Japan, right? The high-speed trains going actually faster than the planes. Lower cost. Competition is high into every air route, and the switching cost. That means for a buyer, it's so easy to switch from one airline to the other, so it's low switching cost for him. So likewise, an airline could take a look at its own possibilities, right, with regard to competitiveness. Take a look at the soft drink industry. We discussed this earlier also. To a certain extent, there's little rivalry. Not many players are there in the soft drink industry. Only about 5 or 6 key players like Pepsi, Coke, Elephant brands, bigger players, and some smaller players. Lesser restrictions to entry. Not many regulations are there, but the costs are high, right? The switching cost, buyers can easily switch from Pepsi to Coke to whatever, right? Brand loyalty could be a bit high, right? The people tend to be loyal to a particular brand here. New entrants, cost is there at the entry, and there's a huge challenge of creating a huge supplier network, and that could be hard for the new entrant. Buyer power, yes, the buyers they could drink water. This is not an essential product. There are substitutes like the tea or coffee or the Nescafe or whatever, right? So the soft drinks command a strong buyer power from the consumers. Suppliers, lesser suppliers, so their ability may be somewhat less. And then what is this Porter thing? Exactly when did it come? That might help us understanding the importance of port. Actually, it came up in 1980s when the world economy was pretty strong across the world. In many countries, there was strong competition coming up. Inventions were happening, not as fast as today, but they were happening. And the marketing and advertising increased, and companies started reaching beyond the borders. And the global market was very healthy. Even Sri Lankan economy was developing at a rate of 7 to 8% per year, GDP. And technological changes not too fast, but very steady. So the competitiveness of the environment was a key thing that the Porter considered as very vital back in the 80s for a new company to come in. It's very relevant even today, right? Maybe a little bit less with extremely high competitive nature of the industry now. It may not be easy to make up a static check and apply it to the future, because if we are applying Porter for the new industries, we'll have to apply Porter every 6 months, like, because that fast is the industry change happening. So we have to be relentless now. Rather than doing a check like this once a year, we may need to do it a couple of times, because new players are coming in continuously. Dynamics is pretty higher. So far more than the 80s, the business environment is fast shifting. But be that as it may, Porter is still solid even today, right? To make a proper industry analysis, identify the industry players, to get the hang of the industry structure, basically the macro aspects of the industry. Porter gives us a solid understanding about, awareness about the business before we begin business. And that understanding might help us to develop competitive advantages. Where can we be good? We can't fight everywhere. We can't fight the suppliers. We cannot fight the buyers. We can't do all that. But where can we be the better person, better company compared to the competition? Porter's 5 forces might help the company to identify the force, or maybe two, or maybe more, that gives the company the competitive advantage. So is it to re-engineer the company, business process re-engineering we call it, or to downsize it? So, or to make all these tough decisions, right? Porter may help. Yeah, let's talk about the inadequacies. This matters a lot, especially at the MBA level. Whatever the principle we apply, we must discuss the principle in a very objective manner, analyze it in an objective manner. So inadequacies or disadvantages are a key. Porter doesn't consider available resources, the micro factor, how much resource we have, the capital or the resource or the talent or the skill. Porter only studies the external aspects, not the internal aspects. So that could be an inadequacy. Let's we identify the macro factors, from the supplier power, the buyer power, right, in new entrants, all that. They're all macro factors. But there's little use of those macro study unless we identify our micro strength. It doesn't look at the built-in competencies of the company. We only study the competition of others from buyer to the supplier, but our own competencies is not taken into account by Porter. Yes, in the fast changing world of today, this analysis of our competition might need to be done several times of the year rather than once a year. We have to be flexible. And the other thing is, the modern businesses go for strategic alliances and joint ventures to suddenly develop a new competitive advantage. This is something that Porter didn't think about, because back in the 1980s this was less, but now we see so much of joint ventures and the strategic alliances happening. So this has been basically the Porter aspect. So it's a pretty important one, and one that can easily be introduced into any analysis of the industry strategy wise. Catch you in another class.